we're ready to go. Welcome to Alchemical Science. I'm Jordan, an open source researcher, and today I'm going to be talking to Mr. Bob Greenyer, who you certainly should know of if you've been paying attention to my channel in the last year. I found out about Bob's work, I think in September last year, and I've spent a lot of time studying it and looking into this since. That started with his work on the analysis of Malcolm Bendel's thunderstorm generator, but he's been analyzing a lot of different reactors from all over the world over the last decade, and he's become and is becoming to be known as one of the world's foremost experts on ball lightning or plasmoid phenomena. So yeah, do you want to give a quick introduction? Anything you want to expand upon that before we get started, Bob?
Well, thank you for that introduction, Jordan. Yes, I met Jordan around the time he's describing last year online. I never actually physically met him till the Cosmic Summit, wasn't it, the first time?
Yeah,
yes.
So only a few months ago, yeah.
So as Jordan was intimating there, I have been a volunteer working for the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project for about a decade, a little more than a decade. In fact, on the 12th of the 12th, at 12 seconds past 12 minutes past 12, we actually did our first replication. So in just a couple of months' time, it will be a full 10 years since we actually verified what's called as low energy nuclear reactions. And this was a system by one Francesco Celani of the Frascati Nuclear Institute in Italy. And he was the first person to have the courage to share his technology with the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project. Obviously named after the late Martin Fleischmann, who along with Stanley Pons in 1989 revealed to the world something that was named by one Stephen E. Jones cold fusion, although they were uncomfortable with the term. So I was keen to find out whether there was a potential solution to the energy problem. I wanted some more children and I wanted to be responsible about that. And I went to a conference along with 4 other people. We started the project. And since then, as Jordan just said, I've had the pleasure and the honor to be invited around the world to test the claims of various researchers in the field and to the side of the field, people that think that they've got something interesting but don't really understand how it may be working. And we've done deep dives into those systems, we've done tests that the researchers never considered, and we've applied the learning along the way with the community. This has been a community effort. It couldn't have bed done without the suggestions and support, even in small donations to the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project. It just couldn't have happened, essentially. And so when we found something, we shared it, and it was this virtuous cycle of people feeding back into the project's knowledge base, and all of that's been shared. And initially, it was on a site called quantumheat.org. That is mostly an archive site. You can go and see the early years of the project there. And it's always been on the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, or at MFMP YouTube channel, where live videos of experiments were broadcast, and more recently, many live videos of discussions about the technology and the research that we have conducted. So it's been an absolute hectic 10 years, but it's been very enlightening. And I want to say right from the bat, thank you to all of those that have been involved with making this happen.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of work going on by a lot of people, and the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project has done more than probably any other independent organization to kind of carry this forward and get the knowledge out there. So before we get into your work, I wanted to ask a little bit about, because I've been staying with Bob for
a while,
nearly 2 months now.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about why that is a little bit later on. But yeah, I've heard some stories now about your life and about how you got into this field, and I found it quite fascinating. So I just wanted to start off from, you know, when you were a kid, like how did these things, because they obviously came up for you again and again and again, and they've really led on to this, and then, yeah, just going through a little bit of a life timeline of these experiences that have led you into this field and how you become a Bohemian ball lightning, I should say Moravian.
Moravian.
This is a Czech Republic joke. Look up the regions. How do you become a Bohemian Moravian ball lightning researcher?
Well, it started for me when I was very, very young. I believed the stories surrounding climate change. And I actually believed them from as early as I can possibly remember until I was about 44. And during that time, right at the beginning, I looked for ways that I could minimize my impact on the environment. I used recycled furniture. In fact, much of the furniture in my house is actually recycled. Some of it from my school, some of it that predates even my father. Or actually, it was actually made in the same decade as my father's birth. Now, my father was very instrumental for me. He was a farmer, and he worked with the land. And when you work with the land and you work with physical things, you feel connected to nature. So I spent a lot of time as a child dealing with plants and dealing with the environment and understanding a little bit about that from a sort of an intuitive sense. My father was a great hard-working physical man, but he was also a senior Mason in the Freemasons, and he was also very respected in the British Navy. I didn't understand this until much later in my life, but anyway, that being said, when I was very young, we had a kind of like motel, and we had a swimming pool, and I tried to make a solar heating system for that using pipes. I tried to have a little solar panel with reflecting mirrors to provide electricity for a fan and a light in my room, in my recycled furniture room, and so forth. So I was always trying to cycle rather than have a car when I was at university. And in fact, for many years after I left university, I didn't have a car at all. I only hired cars when I absolutely needed them. So a lot of my life was built around trying to be minimalist. You know, I bought a house and it had a threadbare carpet, and I lived in it for 9 years. And when I left the house, it still had the same threadbare carpet that I bought the house with. So yeah, I tried to be minimal, and you know, then I thought, well, you know, is there solutions to these that can actually be real solutions that don't denude the environment? So this was always something that was driving me. In those early years, my father, he did some slightly strange things, which I only have realized were fairly strange in recent years. And one of them was when I was about 7 years old in 1979. He asked me and my brothers to come downstairs and my sister and ask us to look east into the sky in Sussex from the house that we were living in, which was 32 Offington Gardens, Worthing, West Sussex, UK. And he kind of looked at his watch, and then in the sky these lights appeared in a regular array horizontally. They went and disappeared. And you know what? He said, you know, go to bed now. And it's like, I never really thought about that even once until one of the sponsors, one of the key sponsors of the project, a Swiss man, kept asking me to look at the Serious Disclosure project of Stephen Greer. And I remember meeting him in Prague. He was a head of a company, and he had some people that he worked with here in the Czech Republic. And I met him, and I went to the bar, and I said, look, you know, I finally took a look at the Serious Disclosure, because I didn't really know what it was. This was a number of years ago. And I said, so you're into unidentified flying objects, I guess. And I said, I have a story to tell about that. And in fact, he was the first person outside of the family that I even considered thinking about telling, because I didn't really think about it. That's the honest truth. I just didn't ever consider it. It was just a thing my dad showed me. And then when this was happening, I thought, well, okay, I might as well disclose this to this individual. So I think, I can't remember when that was. It might have been 2017 or something like that. But my father later showed me a crop circle, which again, I've only really engaged with in fact, recent weeks. And I went back and researched where that crop circle was, and I even managed to find, just before the Internet Archive was shut down, an image. In fact, it was about 5 days before I found this image on an old website that was archived on the Internet Archive, and I managed to scrape that image and find out that it was a very significant form to Masons, it would seem, or rather possibly some of their predecessors in the form of the Knights Templar, if they are connected in any way. Others would be better at knowing this than I. But I'd actually gone with Jordan to the Austrian underground, hadn't I? And they showed something on the altar, which was apparently, it would seem, from the 13th century or 12th century or something like that.
Yeah, I think it might have been the 12th century. Yeah, a long time ago.
Yeah, and it was this particular structure that I'd been discussing as being critical to this technology, and the substructure as being a fractal variation of it, and it's laid out in the same form as this crop circle. And so my father made a big point of taking me to see that. So these weird things, and the other thing is from about those, as early as I can remember, until I was about 10, I kept having these recurring dreams that I would be required to do something starting around my 40th birthday, and it wouldn't be easy. I'd get a lot of ridicule for it. I wouldn't be able to earn any money from it, and those all things are true because it happened. And but it has been an absolute honor to take this job, as it were, or this thing to research these phenomena, and how on earth my father showing me these things back then, I could never have imagined that they would have been able to help tie these concepts together with ball lightning, which these were spheres glowing in the sky. And that was 1979, and the crop circle that he showed me was in 1985 on the Long Furlong in Sussex, just a few kilometers from where we were living. So yeah, so it's been a weird kind of experience to know from before I was even a teenager that I'd be required to do something, and that I would have this information that would carry all the way through and then be valid and help understand, in my view, the reality of it, and that there are things beyond what normal media and normal education are disseminating, that are actually real and were believed by previous civilizations and people that went to investigate those previous civilizations, being the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitalier. Yeah,
absolutely. It really ties into ancient history and so many other fields of science, and that's, you know, the other point I wanted to touch on there is you really do have to be somewhat polymathic to study this field, because there's so many different aspects to it. And that's another thing that I found fascinating about the stories you told me, is about your education and your career path that's led to where you are now and the research you're doing.
Well, it's kind of like I did it because I was stubborn. What actually happened was I was told by, I was fortunate enough that when I was about 10 or 11, for various reasons, one of my brothers had got involved with some bad people, and my parents didn't want me going to the same schools that were available in my hometown. And so there was this assisted place scheme that was available by the then Conservative government, and what it allowed was people from not very wealthy backgrounds, and we're farmers, so you might look like you've got a lot, but you tend to be quite poor most of the time.
Indeed.
Especially because, like, my father employed a lot of people, yeah. And when you've got a lot of people, having been an employer myself, you know, I only had 12 people that I employed maximally, but they were paying for their siblings' education, and they were supporting their own parents in India, yeah. Right? So it turns out that the money that I was paying them in India was actually supporting 50, 60, 70 people, right? My father had more than 100 employees often on the farm, and they're like your family. And so it was difficult from that point of view. But back to the point about am I a polymath? I don't know, but what I can say is that someone told me early in my education, when I got this assisted place, I went to this fantastic school, and I was told at this school, which was born out of Victorian ethics and educational structures, that you could either be an artist or you could be a scientist. And I thought, sod you, I'm going to be both.
Hear, hear.
Because I loved drawing. I loved observing things and trying to create similar objects or physical 3D objects or paintings or pictures. And so I like that aspect, but I was absolutely totally into science and the way nature related to science. And so I thought, you can do both of this. And actually I punished myself through my education. I took the most I could during my A levels. And then I took the hardest course I could find in this big, thick book of courses that was at the universities in the whole of the UK. And it was called Special Engineering Programme, or the people at the university called it Someone Else's Problem, or Systematic Eradication of Personality. But it was every course at the university. And it gave me a broad spectrum understanding of physics, maths, electronics, electrical, material science, legal, social, psychological, accounting, everything. You did everything.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I've run my approach to understanding things. Is I've always said that even the most undesirable person that you personally, as a listener, could imagine in the environment, they have their own life experience, and they might have some unique insight that completes an understanding or corrects a misunderstanding that you might have about how the world works or how society works. Everyone has value. And so that's really how I've tried to engage people in the project. You know, you get people come along and they're very aggressive, saying, "Oh, this is not true," and I say, well, they don't understand, and so what can I do to help them get through that barrier of not understanding? Or maybe they're right. Maybe they've identified a problem in the argument which needs to be either addressed or the argument needs to be adjusted. And so, like, every single one has value. Everyone brings their own unique insights. And so, yeah, and you can be wrong. And I've learned many times that you can be wrong for long periods of time.
Yeah, which is really important to science. You know, that's how we actually get to an answer. No one's ever always right. And yeah, no, I admire this way of not compartmentalizing ideas. I can see how your education played into the approach you take into science now, and just looking at the whole and
I was totally blessed. I was the effort that my parents went to put me to that school and make that happen. It's one of the greatest things you can do for a child, is to give them a good education. Because you can carry that forward into whatever you do. It goes with you, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I total thanks to my mum particularly, who went to a lot of effort, taking extra jobs in order to make that possible. It was a very difficult time in 1979 because there was Dutch subsidies coming in that was making flowers and tomatoes, that were my father's two biggest products, that they could deliver in refrigerated lorries to anywhere in the UK for cheaper than my father's cost of production.
Yeah, right. Yep.
And it took 2 years to destroy the business. And that's how subsidies sometimes can just destroy. And it's been a gameplay of many countries that want to take over markets. You know, you give a subsidy knowing that it's going to destroy the competitors, and once the competitors are now never going to be able to produce again, you can then up the
Yeah.
So I mean, you've probably seen something in your
We've seen that happen in Australia.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Yeah, a major,
I think it's happening.
major issue too.
It's massively happened in the US actually with their meat production as well over the last several years. They developed this whole free range pork farming process, and they kind of like made these factory farms where the pigs are raised in cages, and the cost of production went massively down, but like everyone was forced to buy the feed from the company and work in this particular way, and then they were all controlled by this organization, and you know, it's sad. I like redundancy based in different approaches, and when you have levels of subsidy or manipulation of the way things are made, then it's very awkward.
It always causes problems. I mean, same in Europe with you know, the nitrogen fertilizer bans in certain countries, and then so they're just importing it from other countries. Of course, all the, you know, and I'm an organic farmer, and this is why we're talking a little bit about agriculture, as we both come from a farming background. But yeah, you can see the major issues with government coming in and enforcing these ideas.
Low-energy nuclear reactions may be able to solve the fertilizer issues.
They may indeed, and you should probably check out Bob's latest live streams on the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project to see more about that, because, yeah, these technologies have so much more application than just, you know, cleaning up waste products and creating more energy. It's like the discovery of electromagnetism or of electricity. Like, the applications are so broad.
It's phenomenal. Yeah, absolutely phenomenal. Now, what happened on the art side during my teens, I started getting very interested in 3 dimensions. From the age of about 12, 13, I started sculpting in clay. And then I thought, well, hold on a minute, like sooner or later, we're going to be able to do sculpting in 3D. And I was able to get access to an early release of the debundling of Lightwave from the video toaster. So much of the cable network news in the US at one point was produced with a thing called the video toaster. And I managed to get this early copy, and then I worked at a television production studio who had a video toaster, and I became, along with my business partner at the time then, the both of us, the first 2 official trainers of this 3D software in the UK. Back when I was 21, and I'm 52 now, so that's 31 years ago. I've been using this software for, I think, 33 years, as usual. Good number. It's like your age, really. Yeah. So as long as you've been alive, I've been using Lightwave 3D. And you know, I built an animation business. I was working with big corporate clients like Nike and British American Tobacco, and which was the reason I quit the advertising industry, because they were giving away cigarettes as a promotion on African beaches. So, yeah, so totally unethical. So, but anyway,
who would think?
Who would have thought? Yes. But it was through advertising agencies I made or rescued the BT logo, which was used for a couple of decades. Actually, it's been recently replaced. So I did some fairly large contracts during that time. I eventually took that business to India because I could see the way it was going, that I was kind of like using programming and processes to make complex tasks very, very easy. And by that I mean, like, if you've got to try and make a particular shape, or you've got to make a particular effect like hair or smoke or wind or fire or whatever, you would develop a technique that would work. And if there was millions of people like me around the world, ultimately everything would become a button click, and you'd be able to do great hair, great fire, great explosions, great water, and so on. And I thought, well, you know, if I can't, if this is not going to be my life, I might as well transfer the skills. So I transferred the skills to this group of Indians who were absolutely fantastic. I went from 4,000 and took 4 over a period of 4 months of recruitment, and they were brilliant people. They regularly contact me, and when I've been back to India, I've caught up with some of them. They've all got families now, and so forth. So that was learning to see from a 2D perspective, but even pushing that into the 3D. So I was able to with that skill set, look at things in the natural environment and imagine how a witness mark on a piece of material might have been created by a 3D object. So like seeing a 2D witness mark or something that just has a little bit of bas relief, like there's a little bit of height on a otherwise 2D surface, and imagine how a 3D object could create that 2D witness mark. And so I think almost the most important skill I learnt in order to understand what I was eventually going to see in the reaction witness materials was my training in 3D.
Yeah, and so that's kind of, for reference, you know, this work you've done under the scanning electron microscope, exploring the artifacts of ball lightning in these reactors. And I guess we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But first, I wanted to talk about what I think is probably your most profound and interesting discovery, or rediscovery, or building on the work of many, but you've given it the name, the Fractal Toroidal Moment. And we will look at these images in a moment, but do you want to just give a little bit of an overview of what this is, how you discovered this very, very special geometry, and yeah, just a little introduction to that concept.
So essentially the first thing was I was invited by the late Mahadevan Srinivasan, who was the leader of the Babur Atomic Research Center in India, replication of Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons, okay? And actually we'll talk about Dr. Takaaki Matsumoto later, but he actually has the original 6-month report from that, on which Mahadevan Srinivasan is the first named person on that report. He has an original copy of that, yeah. So he invited me to come and talk about the research that the project was doing into nickel hydrogen systems, both with Piantelli, Dr. Alexander Parkhomov. These names you can go and look up and see their contribution, and one Andrea Rossi, because there was a private and government organization at the Technical University in Mumbai that was in the process of doing research related to those types of technology. And we were at that time working with the people that were willing to share. And Francesco Piantelli was the discoverer of the nickel hydrogen system, and of the people that were being open, it was Dr. Alexander Parkhomov who was being most open with their methods and procedures for creating the effect. And so we had worked with those two. So I went in 2017 to give a talk. I gave a talk, and during that talk I said that I think these effects are all caused by ball lightning. Because I had had a meeting with one Dr. Georgi Egli, who from the 1980s has been considered one of the world's leading experts on the observation and recording of anecdotes of natural ball lightning effects. And so he produced 2 books on this and made speculations and theories about how things were happening in ball lightning. And so from October in 2016 to when I was giving this presentation at the beginning of March in 2017, I had come to the conclusion that ball lightning was probably at the root cause of many of the LENR observed effects. So I gave this presentation, and I said that if this is the case, it'll be these kind of things that you need to trigger the effect, and these would promote it and so forth. And you know, a lot of the nuclear scientists in the room and these 7 or 8 students that had come to watch the presentation, they were in a state of shock and or confusion that I was saying this. But there was one guy, a guy called Suhas Ralkar. He was in his 70s. He was one of the world leading experts right from the beginning in ultrasound. In fact, I think he worked on the original kind of development of ultrasound in the UK that is used for taking pictures of babies when you're in gestation. And he had developed with his wife, who is a similar age and a brilliant chemist, some technologies, and he just sat there with his mouth open in shock, because he'd spent about $1 million and the 4 years of his life as an expert in ultrasound, and his wife being an expert in chemistry, And I was just laying it down from intuition based on a few observations, essentially, having not spent a lot of the project's money at all. And the reason that came about, actually, was because when we visited Francesco Piantelli, as I mentioned before, the inventor of the nickel hydrogen system, he said, don't tell nature what it is, let it show you, right? Because the whole field had been told, because it was called cold fusion, that they needed to find the products of ordinary hot fusion, which are neutrons, gamma, and X-rays, right? But you typically didn't find those things. And so we decided to take the advice of Francesco Piantelli and start looking, rather than being told what to look for, and if you don't find them, you haven't found anything, right? Just looking at actually what has happened. And that's how I came to start in 2015 that approach, and changed it and got to that point of in early 2017 of realizing ball lightning was probably the mechanism that was going on. And essentially what happened was the Indian scientists and in the tea break, they almost couldn't speak to me because I'd been talking about ball lightning. But Suhas Ralkar came up to me and he tapped me on the shoulder and says, what are you doing tomorrow? And I'd been invited to go out and speak to these students and go and tour around the city. But he says, I'd like you to come to my lab. And he didn't really say what for. But some of the effects that I said you should occur in these systems, I was saying that it should occur. The following morning, I was able to witness them in his lab. And what I also did is I found that in one of his ultrasound columns, he had this big column with this helical ultrasound horn. It was hollow. It produced these toroidal vortex bubble structures, which had substructures in them. And in the substructures, which were equidistantly spaced, there was helical braids coming in and then folding in. Okay, and they were able to pull in other substructures which seemed to accelerate into them and essentially become part of them. So they were able to consume self-similar structures into their core, take the energy out of them and build themselves, and had these weird braided, twisted things around the outside. And it also had its own kind of wave function around the outside. So this was very interesting to me, and I kind of parked that thought, and then I started thinking, you know, what is this? And actually, when I was at school, when I was 18, for my physics practical, I worked with this guy called Alan Frost. His father had a scenery company, made the original Alien's tail, made the original mask or scenery for Star Wars, made the gold bars for the Italian Job. I was a good friend with this guy, and we did this physics practical where we built this 1/3 of a ton tank, and then in the woodworking shop we lathed different hulls or shapes, and we had a standard back end, and then we just had the front of the boat basically with different profiles, and then we had a weight on a pulley, and we saw how fast it could accelerate and the terminal velocity in this water tank. Okay, and the idea was to try and understand how the different shapes could end up by changing the hydrodynamics. And so I had, that's basically all I'd ever done in hydrodynamics, other than some basic physics at university and so on. But I recognized that this was hydrodynamics, and it produced these weird kind of structures where it seemed like the bubbles were all going into a center. There was nowhere, because like the bubbles only form where there's a depressurization, and where was it going? Because it was like a big kind of like leaf shape, yeah? There must be something that it's going into, and I didn't quite grasp what that was. But I understood it was hydrodynamics, and then I started realizing that there are other systems out there where you have a thing called magnetohydrodynamics, where when you get these hydrodynamic flows, and it's, if you can imagine, you take a plate and you put it in water, and you get a vortex and an anti-vortex, and this produces what's called a phallico-soliton. It's like a half soliton under the water, and like a half ring soliton. These are very easy things to replicate, and you see like two spot shadows on the bottom of the swimming pool with the sun refracting through it. To cut a long story short, I saw similar structures in 2017, later in that year, in a reactor produced by an English guy, sadly passed away, called Neil Crichton Gold. And in this LENR reactor, it had these kind of phallicosolitons on exposed X-rays after the reactor was shut down. And I imagined this phallicosoliton, so I thought there must be a vortex and an anti-vortex structure in there. And I drew a diagram of what it would look like. And I thought, I need to go back to the SEM. And this is when we're starting to look at SEMs and see if there are any like mirrored structures on there that could account for these two spots in the X-ray film. I went back 3 days later, and yes, all over the reactor there were these mirrored structures that you could imagine were the kind of the similar to the holes of the vortex and the anti-vortex that you get in the swimming pool. It was a weird thing, and it started a journey of looking and studying and thinking, well, if this is true, this is what I would expect to see under the microscope, and then seeing it under the microscope. And it's been a fantastically rewarding experience. And to be able to predict that someone in California will see a certain thing, and they do, or to predict that there will be something on the thunderstorm generator, and it is. And so like, and then when you are, it started to emerge in my mind, the 3D structure that was able to produce this. And minimally, it needed to be a vortex and an anti-vortex, which intersected such that it made the Vesica Pisces. And then you get two half-diameter circles, and they come together in the center. And that is the basic structure of hydrodynamics, which you would see in papers from the 1950s, for instance, or even videos, like these old videos, like, you know, with a very well-spoken sort of Boston accent talking over the top of the video, you know. Yeah. I'm not very good at Boston accent. But these wonderful videos, and I saw these structures etched into pieces of these LENR reactors, as Neil Crichton Gold called them, on the outside of the reactor, and 12 millimeters across. And I'm saying this is the same this is the same as a hydrodynamic structure, but it's got to be magnetohydrodynamic. And weirdly, it's causing disruption of fused quartz, which normally melts or degrades over 1700 degrees centigrade. But we know the reactor, even in the core, is not going above 1050. And outside of the structure, it's perfectly unaffected. So something is able to manipulate, and it wasn't just that, it was manipulating the copper, it was manipulating the high temperature ceramic tube, it was manipulating the alumina. So something was able to fluidize these refractory materials, but with extremely discrete event horizons. And these aren't conductors. Typically, it's not a conductor. You know, fused quartz, it's one of the highest dielectric constant there is of a material, okay? So like, what is going on that's causing this material to disrupt? And it was a bit longer than that, and I was thinking of disruptions, and then in my back of my head, I thought, well, you know, this is similar to kind of the Hutchison effect, which I'd seen, you know, in early YouTube videos and maybe some programs on cable TV when I'd been traveling or whatever, about this guy called John Hutchison. And John Hutchison had worked with Tesla disruptive discharges, some uranite as a radioactive source, and some either Van de Graaff generators or Tesla coils, and created some various field structures, and then RF. And in 1979, which was weird because it was the same year I was seeing these glowing balls in the sky, you know, he was levitating objects, he was putting metals into other metals, wood into other metals, making metals apparently turn to jelly, and capturing these things on high-8 or cinema, you know, cine film. And I thought, well, is this the same thing? It's just doing this disruption and so forth. And to cut a long story short, through a guy called Andrew Johnson, he defended some comments that I was making on a blog where someone was trying to dox me and saying I'd gone mad. And this apparently had been out on a public website, and this guy was a LENR researcher who never really did any research, but liked to comment on people and say things.
Disinformation.
I don't know.
Allegedly.
Bless him, he's gone into the other side. Oh. But he was he was basically doxing me and my family and saying that basically I'd gone mad. And this had been up online for at least half a year. And I was traveling to the UK for a reason. And this guy, Andrew Johnson, had come onto their website the same day as I looked at this website. And the reason I'd looked at this website is my friend, for some reason, was Googling my name and came up with this website with all of my, you know, contact details and saying that I'm mad and I'd completely lost it. I was talking about ball lightning was what was causing LENR, and this had been sitting out there for 6 months. And on the day that I looked, bearing in mind it was on there for 6 months, this guy Andrew Johnson had said, "Well, I don't know, what you're saying about whether he's mad or not, but what he's saying about this effect is true." And so I thought, well, okay, I'm gonna. From his link, I could reach out to him through the associated chat system, and I said, "Look, I'm coming to the UK. I've got some time on Sunday. Do you want to meet up?" And so we met up, and to cut a long story short, I got to speak with Dr. Judy Wood. That connected me with the work of Ken Shoulders, who I was already looking into, and it connected me to the work of John Hutchison, who I was already looking into. And we'd actually already, in 2016 or 17, created iron-rich crenellated microspheres in a plasma ball lightning reactor that was the brainchild of Dr. George Eagley, who actually came with me to India on a subsequent trip from the initial one to further investigate the work of Suhas Ralkar. And so Andrew Johnson got me in contact with John Hutchison, and the project bought several samples. And I said, "John, I don't want anything big. I just want interesting samples that you think might show whatever it is you think you've done." Okay? And on one of those samples, I called it fracture, under a basic Dynalite 230 times microscope, I was able to see these yin-yang torus-like structures that seemed to be quantized if you imagined that you took a torus and then you rotated it 90 degrees and made another torus made of tori, and then you took that structure and you rotated that 90 degrees and made another torus made of tori. And so in February the 17th, 2020, I published what I thought was the structure of the physical vacuum, because I couldn't see anything else would fit. And I said that this is a wheel within a wheel within a wheel. It's an electrodynamic structure. I'm not entirely sure how they fit together, but I think it's kind of like you've got a current ring, it makes a magnetic azimuth, and it links together magnetically into a magnetic ring, and then probably that produces a electric field azimuth, and then it electrostatically joins together. And that's how I thought it was. And I shared that with the Russian community in cold nuclear transmutation and ball lightning. And then there was comments about that. That was in 2018, in October, at the Russian Conference on Cold Nuclear Transmutation and Ball Lightning in Sochi. Now the Russians, they literally called it what it was since the beginning. Cold nuclear transmutation and ball lightning. Like they weren't beating around the bush. Yeah. So like I felt this community was receptive, and again it was one of those moments when I went through my initial what I called O-Day slides, which were about 1/3 of those original slide deck, which I then took about 6 to 7 years to get out. They were again with their mouths open and aghast. It was the same experience I had with Suhas Ralkar, but there was a whole bunch of them in the room, because you don't get to see what I'm looking at. and I thought, okay, I might have come across something here, because these are very serious scientists, far more serious than me, and they think that I'm saying something that, yeah. So that was an interesting experience, and then later I was working with a guy called Henk Uren in Holland. He had reached out to the Sapphire group that were replicating some previous work in plasmas to try and verify the electric sun model. And, you know, they were creating these double layers, which have been known for a very long time, and these self-organizing sphere arrangements, which have been known for a very long time, but they produce a very nice experiment demonstrating the effect. He reached out to them, they weren't interested, and so he then reached out to the MFMP, and we worked with him and we're still working with him. But he shared a sample which he showed me, and I immediately, because I'd already studied this, showed me something that looked like a magnetic fluid, and it created these wormhole like wormwood, like oak holes in, you know, you get oak and you get the worm burrows through, and when you cut it, it has these little holes, right? It was like that. And I already knew that this was the behavior of a magnetic fluid, and it was between two brass plates on top with a gap in between, and a large brass plate below, low pressure atmosphere with normal air with a little bit of hydrogen, 200 volt bias from the anode. This was the cathode, the rest of the chamber was the cathode, and it basically produced these structures. And in there were these kind of things that look like vortexes and anti-vortexes. And over a period of time on studying that, it became very clear that some structures that we had seen in other systems were basically made from fluidized electrons in some form. These were aligning with the claims and observations of one Kenneth Radford Shoulders, who was brought in to investigate John Hutchison's work by a guy called Harold Puthoff, right, who was US Naval Intelligence and got his fingers everywhere, right? In fact, you can see a picture in the Sapphire project with him in the control room, right? So like, he's kind of everywhere. And so this was very, very interesting. During that work, I found these blown up structures which also had these iron-rich crenellated spheres in, which I predicted would be in this system, because in an ultrasound system, I'd already predicted they were in there. And so a pattern was emerging that if you took a hydrodynamic system and you put it into a charge separated, that is like a plasma, or a polar medium like water, you then produce a magnetohydrodynamic system. And in the Henk Uren experiments, I observed the collapsed wave functions of these, what I call the fractal toroidal structures. And I shared this in the end of April, the last days in the end of April, in fact it was the last day, with the Russian group, along with my initial concept of the toroidal thing from studying the Lion work from Neil Crichton Gold, the wheel within a wheel within a wheel toroidal structure that I derived from the Hutchison sample, and then I showed these multiple instances of this collapsed wave function of what would have been one of these fractal toroidal structures. And immediately, within about, I don't know, 40 minutes, one of the Russian researchers just sent me a paper from 1995 that was published in the Russian journal Biology of Life by a guy called Zverblis. And he was talking about something that he saw in a Moscow basement in 1988. And he showed a current loop. And if you take a minimum of 2 current loops and an anti-loop, you get a magnetic loop. And then those can then be rotated and produce a third order structure, which produces, and he said a current loop at the time. And in 1992, he had someone that he had approached when he'd seen this thing in 1988, where it produced this electromagnetic phantom. That is something that still produced a magnetic oscillating frequency in a piece of quantum locked space in a lab, even when you turn off the device and you move it to the other side of the room for 2 days. he didn't believe it, so he said, look, is there some way that you can create an electromagnetic phantom? And so this guy Nevesky, he was a major mathematician and physicist at the Russian Academy of Sciences. He did the extension of the Maxwell equations and found that yes, once you get to the third structure, the pointing vectors close in on themselves into a loop, and if you've got 4, you have a loop and then a loop at 90 degrees like this, and you create what's called a vacuum current, which means the energy doesn't dissipate, so you can pile more and more and more energy into a closed volume. And it was much later that Freiberger said, so in that paper they effectively say that you can capture the photons from vacuum fluctuations. And so you can effectively capture 0-point energy, because if you have a positron and an electron appearing in the vacuum fluctuations and they immediately annihilate, then they will produce 2 photons, and the photons can be captured by this electromagnetic phantom, so it can effectively capture the 0-point energy, which is something that was said by Ken Shoulders. And later, there was a guy called David Freiberger at the Stanford Linear Accelerator, the national accelerator in Stanford, in California. He said that doing a similar treatment, that it was able to produce a diality angle that was so high, that's what he called it. But anyway, to cut a long story short, when you get over a critical threshold, it would cause baryons, that is protons or neutrons, the bits that are in the nucleus of an atom, it would cause them, and these are his words, to lose their reference with the Dirac sea, and then the baryon would fall apart. And so this was actually deconstruction, full deconstruction of matter. So you have both capture of 0-point energy, 0-point fluctuations, and you also have deconstruction of matter, and both of them can capture energy. And this is mind-boggling, but it certainly leads you to understand some of the things that are observed in low-energy nuclear reactions. And essentially, that led me to connect to the work of Vladimir Dubovik. And in 1965, Vladimir Dubovik reframed electrodynamics on that third-order structure. So rather than the electric loop making a current, then the electric loop making a magnetic dipole, and then the magnetic link together making another electric azimuth, it doesn't. It produces what's called a toroidal moment. And he published this in 1967 as his thesis in Dubna, the nuclear research facility in north of Moscow. And it wasn't until 1997 that it was verified in the West. And I realized that these structures were actually producing toroidal moments. And so I thought, well, it's a fractal toroidal structure. Each of them, as long as they've got at least 3 subtiers. So I basically said it's a wheel within a wheel within a wheel. And the smaller substructure is self-similar to the overall structure. So then that could be a wheel within a wheel within a wheel. But for every wheel within a wheel within a wheel, you produce a toroidal moment. And so if the substructure has a wheel within a wheel within a wheel, that is a fractal subquanta of the overall structure. Yep. And that will also have its toroidal moment. So then you have a fractal structure of the big structure that then has an overall structure that has a fractal toroidal moment. And it wasn't until I thought I was going out on a limb here, until I read in a mainstream peer-reviewed journal in the West, they said these complex current structures where you have this wheel within wheel with a wheel can end up being a fractal toroidal structure. So I thought, I'm bang on the money here. And the way this can manipulate matter is absolutely fantastic. And so that is essentially, I know it's... We're
going to cut some images in here so people can visualize what you're saying a little better afterwards.
So that is coming to the fractal toroidal moment.
Yeah, which is, as I say, I think one of the most fascinating discoveries of our time, or rediscoveries clearly, because we do hear all of these things spoken about, and as you say, we saw the same kind of structures.
For me, it's just a realization. I've been, ever since I switched mode, I've called it a realization. It's nature. You cannot own it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I feel for the people that have developed technologies on these, because they've tried to mask it in some sort of IP. Maybe they don't know how it works, and that's okay. because they think they've discovered something. Or maybe they do how it works and they're deliberately misleading about how it actually manifests, how it's driven and what is going on.
Yeah.
So that they can have some commercial, you know, aspect to it.
And obviously a lot of things have been tied up in military research and all of this. So there's been a lot of, misinformation.
For sure what I was shown,
For
sure what I was shown in 1979 was military research.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until last year that someone sent me, after I gave a presentation, a paper that's on NASA's website called Field Propulsion Systems by A.C. Holt, and that was from 1979. And when you look at how it is structured, the thing that would be suitable for intergalactic transport and would replicate, and it lists all of the phenomena observed by so-called UFOs that have been in 2023 supposedly revealed to Congress. It's already in this document on NASA's website from 1979. Literally all of the 24,000 miles an hour turning right angles, coming in and out of view, causing radiation problems for people that have been close to them. These kind of things, all of those things that are revealed were in this 1979 document. And they said that this structure would be the drive structure. And what they have is a current loop, current loop, current loop, current loop, 6 current loops in a loop. And that makes a toroidal moment. In fact, they show the magnetic field lines reconnecting and producing what's called a phase singularity. That's where you keep spinning around, but you're not going through anymore, right? It's like an Escher, or you're like a Penrose staircase. You keep going around that way or that way, and you're not going up or down. You're just going round, right? Yeah. So you keep increasing your phase angle, but you're not changing your position. And the beauty of this is it allows for coherence of any matter at any temperature. So you can create a condensate of matter, bosons, even from electrons or fermions, which can't ordinarily, because of the Pauli exclusion principle, occupy the same space-time. You can convert those into bosons, and then they can occupy the same space-time. And once you get the electrons at that scale, an electron spinning around a fixed radius is going to produce a magnetic field. And if you keep piling electrons in there and you can't stop the electrons going into this single space, that magnetic field is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger.
Yeah, yeah.
And so you get what's called topological monopole. And this can basically, as Freiberger determined and was determined by Nevesky, it has the ability to do magic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really encourage everyone to go and check out Bob's O-Day videos on this. They've been coming out for a number of years now, and you can see the theory developing. It's a little hard to get your head around for a start, at least most people tell me, and I agree with them. But yeah, there is, it really tells the story of these structures. What I would recommend is people do not jump in now. They jump in the beginning of 2018. Yeah, so
you have to go to start from the beginning, and if you watch it on double time, people say they can do it easily in about 4 months.
Well, this is a kind of a paradox, because we need a time machine and we need this technology to get in that time machine and go back to that period. But you can see the videos on the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project. They're all there, about 1,400 of them. And
well, the key ones, if you go, so I have a blog called remoteview.icu. It starts off with one patent from Lockheed Martin called Systems and Methods for Generating Coherent Matter Waves. And they describe a Ken Shoulders type electron cluster generator going through a means by which the matter can be cohered further into larger clusters and emitted, and effectively creating this coherent matter that can come out and do all of the magic you could possibly imagine. And it's literally listed in this awarded patent. I think it was published in 2013. I think it was available. I think it was they have priority from 2011 or 12. And so I start by saying the answer as far as Lockheed Martin is concerned, and all of the things that it can do, which would explain many of the things that look anomalous, right? And then I say, well, actually, there's this known phenomena, which they never mention, the toroidal moment, because that would be too close to letting people know, I think. Or maybe they don't know. They've just found a system that works, and this is their best guess at explaining it. And of course, they got the patent because this
equipment produces this thing which can do these things, right? But without going too close to what I believe is the underlying principle, okay? And very, very simply, when you make some form of charge separation, whether it's ions and electrons in a plasma or polar material like water, and you create extreme turbulence in there, these structures will self-organize. They will produce fractal toroidal magnetohydrodynamic structures. These lead to the toroidal moment, and the toroidal moment can interact with non-charged particles, which also have a toroidal moment, like relic neutrinos. And you can then capture the relic neutrinos into the same phase singularity. And so you take these relic neutrinos, all clusters thereof, which can be up to microns to millimeters with the research which I helped translate of Dr. Alexander Parkhomov. He established this over decades of experiments in his book, Space, Earth, Human. You can actually go and buy this book. It shows the exact learning process by which he discovered this, what he called initially N radiation. And he realized that because it can cause inverse beta decay, that is, the neutrinos coming in on the left-hand side of the equation, and it's forcing, let's say, potassium-40 to emit an electron and so on, without emitting the antineutrino. And so it's going to calcium-40. You are forcing a decay. It must be a neutrino-like structure. So whatever you think it is, it has the same properties as a neutrino, but it's neutral, but it partially reflects by ordinary matter. And so it must have a level of interaction with ordinary matter. And so he determined these things were microns to millimeters, and these magnetohydrodynamic fractal toroidal moment bearing structures, they can pull in these non-charged particles, which ordinarily you have very little way to manipulate. And just to give some naming conventions here, in 1948, Winston Bostick was charged with setting up a project called Project Sherwood. Now, this is before the hydrogen bomb was detonated in the early 1950s, but it was, they had a clue that this was going to be possible, right? So they thought, well, we need when people see this thing, we're going to need a way to show this isn't all about killing people. We want to make this the next technology for energy generation. Can we find a way to convert the power of the thermonuclear bomb into domestic fusion? And so by 1957, he was starting to really majorly publish his work. And essentially, he had a deuterated titanium electrode and another deuterated titanium electrode opposite each other, producing a 10,000 amp pulse of current going through it, would vaporize some and ionize the deuterium and the titanium and produce a current loop, magnetic reconnection on this side, magnetic counter rotation connection, and they would launch towards each other over a magnetic field, and they would spin around each other. And in doing so, without realizing it, or maybe he did realize it, that produces the bare minimum for the toroidal moment. So the very first, what he called plasmoid, was a toroidal moment bearing structure. And this work continued to 1980. They had many of these things coming together, and he showed that when these structures impacted a witness material, it produced a torus structure with ring spokes. But that's as far as he got with the imagery. Maybe they got better imagery, but they never publicly shared it, to the best of my knowledge. So our work took that understanding way towards the next level, so you can visually see how these things manifest. And we've got impact marks from Henk Juren's experiments, which are absolutely explicitly showing the various levels of fractal accumulation you can get in these structures. We can actually see the torus in a plasma ball by looking through the outside sheath, and it looks like a ball lightning, and then you can see through by changing the exposure on modern cameras, and you can see the torus and the tornado vortex coming into the core. So you actually get to see these structures. And during this process, I was able to leverage my 3D understanding to create a 3D structure. So I gave a presentation called Ode Another Dimension. where I revealed for the first time how I derived the 3D structure. I had it in my head for a couple of years, but I thought I want to see more data, and so that I have more waypoints in order to make sure I get this right. And they came together beautifully from all different types of systems, from different authors, and our own research in what we call the Ultra experiment, which is a basic hydrodynamic experiment with aluminium foil, thanks to Alan Cusk taking up the challenge of trying a different metal. He chose aluminium. We used indium in our first test, which was an accident, by the way. You can go and see about that. But essentially, this 3D structure, I did a back-to-back presentation where I revealed that the Great Pyramid of Egypt almost certainly was a relic neutrino or ether cluster aggregation system. And its internal geometry absolutely perfectly aligns with this same 3D structure. Even the fact that the position of the so-called sarcophagus, the position of the ascending passage and the descending passage and the actual subterranean chamber, everything is positioned exactly correctly. So like when you line it all up so that it aligns with this geometry, and the geometry is the sacred geometry. And it would appear, in my view, that this is the program, very simple program, that runs the entire universe. And we, our face, our body, and so on, is made in the design of the program that runs the universe.
Yeah. This kind of comes back to that man is made in the image of God, and it's weird. We can see this geometry everywhere, in plants, in humans, in reactors, in planetary and celestial systems. It's
and these things are resonant. Like when you actually look at the structure, it has, if you go from the top of the apple, of course apple's in the Bible, and apple's what Newton found was, it inspired him to gravity. Actually, apple's not in the Bible. It was assumed to be the apple, right? It was the fruit of the tree of knowledge or whatever, but like it was assumed to be the apple, and I wonder why they chose that, right? I'll have a video on an apple, some cross sections of an apple. I think you'll like it.
That sounds good.
Yeah, so if you take the top of the apple structure, which is this part of the magnetohydrodynamic structure, right? And you go to the center point of that distance compared to the distance from the center point down to the point of destruction is exactly the golden ratio. Yeah. And when you realize the point of assembly and disassembly, and this point of either projection of matter or injection of matter, whether it's injection is yin and projection is yang, whether it's one or the other, they're all this golden ratio, and then it starts to explain why your body parts are the ratio they are. And when you understand those two concepts, it will be obvious that if the local conditions are chemically and gravitationally and thermally correct or suitable, humanoid form is the answer to the program that runs the universe. And so it is quite likely that if we go to another planet with sentient beings, they will look a lot like us. Yeah, we're seeing this same pattern everywhere, and it doesn't get much more fundamental than that. And with that, we're going to go on a quick break and then come back and talk about the work of Dr. Takaaki Matsumoto, and we'll be back in a moment. All right, and we are back talking today with Bob Greenyer. And I just wanted to finish off this interview with a very important work that I've been here in the Czech Republic helping Bob with for the last couple months. I'm going to get Bob to introduce it properly, but the work of Dr. Takaaki Matsumoto, and also just a huge thank you to Bob and the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project for sponsoring my trip over here to help, and also to Malcolm Bendel, who helped out with me staying for a little bit longer when we realized how, well, Bob knew, but I didn't realize what an enormous project this was. So and thank you for everyone who has donated to those different projects to be able to make that happen. So just wanted you to explain a little bit about
Dr. Takaaki Matsumoto's work, who he was, and how you came to find out about him and become the unofficial archiver of his life.
I think even official.
Yeah, we could call it official. Yeah. Unofficial is not the right word.
So I effectively, I had not heard about his work at all mentioned once in the field until I went to the Russian Cold Nuclear Transmutation and Ball Lightning Conference in Sochi in October 2018. And during that conference, someone had mentioned his work. And I thought, who is this? And fortunately, I had been to Aarhus University, and there was a guy called Dieter Britz there, who was an archivist of all peer-reviewed papers that were published in mainstream journals. And he'd given that archive to me, and I had that with me, and I was able to, whilst I was at the conference, start reading Dr. Matsumoto's papers. And I thought, why is no one following this approach to the research? And it took a long time to decode what had happened. It was basically between 1993 and 1994 that Ed Lewis, a researcher in the field, who had worked earlier with other researchers and had established that ball lightning / plasmoids, as they were called, and as he referred to them then, were the principal guiding structure that was potentially doing this cold fusion. He got there a lot sooner than me, and at least at that level. And Matsumoto at the time, he had this theory which was born out of his experience in traditional nuclear science. Now, Matsumoto was a consummate professional in nuclear research. He worked in the Kerr nuclear reactor in Japan, and then he went on to do linear colliders. You can see images, eventually you will, of him touring around the world looking at various different colliders. And so he cut his teeth in what would be referred to as mainstream nuclear science. And he became an expert in nuclear emulsions. When the Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons event happened in 1989, he immediately switched gears into researching this at his university in Hokkaido in the Northern Island, Japan, at Sapporo, and at the university there. And he applied his skill set, which was in nuclear emulsions, which hadn't really been used much in the field. And he came up with a theory called the natto model, because what he was seeing under the microscope looked a little bit like fermented soybeans and this kind of like slimy, sticky goo that comes between them. And he called this goo that was binding all these beans together itonic clusters. And they are clusters of a thing called an iton. And in his book, what happens was electrons came together with such force that they were able to polarize a proton to produce a positron and a neutrino. And they came out leaving a neutron, and the positron, the neutrino, and the electron became what he calls an iton, which was a quasi-particle, and together the whole cluster effectively is a neutral structure. And then the itons are able to bind together and form what's called an itonic cluster, and these then form a mesh-like structure over which there is neutrons in the center. And so this would work for a protium nuclei, that's atomic hydrogen with just the proton in the nuclei, the most simple nuclei. And it would also work for anything that also contained neutrons. And it would just be polarizing the protons that are in the nuclei. So if you take a deuterium atom, you've got a proton and a neutron. You take D2, which is the molecule. If you take both of those protons and make those into, effectively with the electrons, two itons, an iton pair, and then you have two neutrons and then an additional two neutrons synthesized, you have what's called a quad neutron. So his initial understanding was that quad neutrons were formed. These would explode under this gravitational collapse because there's nothing stopping. There's no charge repelling anything. The whole thing can just collapse in on itself, and these would explode and they would fire out the decay products of a black hole formed from quad neutron decay.
So this was his first book in 1990. So he went from 1989, you know, March. By 1990, he was publishing a book which on the front cover had a structure that he thought was a quad neutron decay. He then continued publishing in the American Nuclear Science Journal, or Fusion Technology, until around about 1993. And in 1993, he had some discussions with a researcher called Ed Lewis, who informed him about that he believed that these things called plasmoids, which we explained are the earliest name for these kind of structures made out of charged matter that's self-organized, but there wasn't really a real understanding when it was given the name plasmoids back then as to what the actual substructures were. But it was noted that these things were a little bit like ball lightning / micro ball lightning. And it was when I was in this field and I had never heard of him before, it took me a bit of time to find out what happened to him being not spoke about in the field. And it was between 1993 and 1994 when he started referring to these structures not as itonic clusters. Everyone was happy to have for him to have his own theory and that it was something exotic and so on. They would allow that to be published. But when he started talking about it being ball lightning, then the drawbridge was pulled up, and the Fusion Technology Journal changed its rules and said if you're not seeing neutrons, gamma rays or X-rays, you don't get to publish, right? And in his typical Japanese way, he gave a little protest note to the editor, and that was the last time he was able to publish in Fusion Technology. An incredible loss, and I think it's deliberate because the same time, the same thing later in early 2000s when Ken Shoulders, who was investigating John Hutchison, was talking about his exotic vacuum objects, which he said also was the same thing as ball lightning / micro ball lightning. When he referred to that being the case, then former researcher at Los Alamos National Laboratory requested the archivist at lenr to remove Ken Shoulders' work. So I never heard about either of these authors, but I learned the importance of Ken Shoulders' work in late 2016 into early 2017. We spoke about that earlier, and I've spoken about it many times. It was later in 2018 that I really started to be able to engage with Dr. Takaaki Matsumoto. So ball lightning was the thing that shut people down. When people mentioned this natural phenomenon, of course, if it's natural, you can't patent it, right? So you could argue that there's not anything more nefarious going on than we can't have this being a natural phenomenon because we can't patent it. It could be just like that, but maybe not so. Essentially, he was shut down, and I learned of him and started seeing that he also considered that this was eventually, he learned by the mid to latter half of the 1990s that it wasn't just quad neutrons that were decaying, and in fact he apologized in a letter to the editor to Fusion Technology in 2001 that he realized much later that actually it was similar to the stuff that Ken Shoulders had found. It was micro ball lightning or ball lightning, and that it was actually billions if not trillions of atoms that are simultaneously transmuting in something that enables that to happen. Still electro-nuclear collapse, which is what he called it, and you've still got this electro-nuclear regeneration of normally stable, in fact almost essentially always stable elements regardless of what you put in, and typically these kind of stellar synthesis / supernova type synthesis elements that you get out, but skewed to things like carbon, common elements like carbon, calcium, iron, these kind of things. And so it was the fact that these two people were shut down really reinforced my understanding that at least someone out there knows that ball lightning is the key. And so I really started getting interested in his work, and I really thoroughly read through his papers and stuff. And I was told by I can't even remember who it was in the field, but I was told that he died of cancer in 2013. So again, I missed speaking to this luminary, and it was frustrating because I was learning so much by looking at what the actual experiment had done, by observing what nature had done and thinking, how was that possible in 3 dimensions? How was it possible electrodynamically, and so forth? And what I could see is that Matsumoto was taking that what has it actually done approach years before. He was doing it in the 1990s. I was doing it in the mid-2010s, right? But he was taking the same approach, using the best microscopes, the best videography, the best macro photography he could do. And he was such a maverick and totally different approach to researching. And it was his use of the video camera with a microscope objective. So it was like video microscopy, unique in the field. I ended up doing it without knowing he was doing it, but it was unique at that time. And he was a trailblazer. So he saw things that other people couldn't possibly even imagine. He saw the dynamics going on in the experiments. But he then did something else which was unique. He brought forward his skill set in nuclear emulsions, radiographic emulsions, and applied them to his experiments in a way that no one had done before or since. And he found structures that were not alpha, beta, gamma, X-rays. He found structures that were much more highly ordered and structured on these X-ray radiographic emulsions. And then he started seeing the same kind of structures on things like a copper witness plate. And so the picture started to emerge, or that it was this ball lightning, and he started talking about it. He was shut down. And so when I realized that he was treating this as ball lightning, I thought, okay, we have 2 people. I've come to the same conclusion from actually observing multiple experiments by independent authors. I want to be able to see, because I could see that there were kind of papers that he had that were unpublished, okay? And I wanted to see if where he worked, Hokkaido University, had these available. So I reached out to my Japanese colleague, Sho, thank you very much, Sho, and I said, look, can you approach the university and say, look, do you have any of these papers in your archives? Well, I'd very much appreciate them, whether they're Japanese or whatever, you know, I'd like to see them. And within 10 days, Sho received a copy of this book. This is the last copy of the book. It will be available on the Kickstarter, which we'll talk about in a little while. Steps to the Discovery of Electro-Nuclear Collapse. And inside, it had a note to say, thank you very much for your interest in my work. Here's a copy of my book, blah, blah, blah. Matsumoto was very much alive. And so we started having a plan. It was in the COVID period, so people couldn't travel around, but I was absolutely determined to go and visit him. We shared some of my work with him. He could see there was correlations in the observations with his observations. I was talking about ball lightning. He was talking about ball lightning. I was talking about massive transmutation of a large number of atoms, not 2 atoms coming together and the statistics. No, vast numbers of atoms simultaneously transmuting. And we had found exactly the same kind of ejections and structures and type of chemicals coming out of these processes as he had. And so we ended up having an opportunity to go over there. I was given 3 dates. I chose the very first one because I had an experience early in my life where I had an opportunity to go see someone. I bought the tickets to New York to go and see them. It was a guy called Byron Goldman. He was a fantastic impresario, did like 50 plus musicals on Broadway. But he said, look, I'm feeling bad, come in January. And unfortunately, he actually wasn't, he didn't have a cold. He had got cancer and it was terminal, and I never got to see him again. So I wasn't going to make that mistake again. I said, I have to go on the first time show. So I booked the first flight I could possibly do on the first available dates that was given to me that I could come and see him. We turned up. He was too ill, actually, to see us. We got some materials to work with, and what I didn't realize is he had a vast amount of material, But at that time, we were just given a couple of papers and some video recordings. So we thought that's all there was. And we did a good job of capturing those and discussing those. And they were very, very nervous about meeting them. He was very paranoid because he thought people were out to get him, and he was right. So on the last day, we had this incredible opportunity to meet him. It was one of those times in your life, I don't know if you've ever had it, where even though it was a short meeting, it felt like we were there for hours and hours and hours and hours.
Yeah,
right?
The
time just stretched. And what happened is when we first came, the whole family were a bit suspicious, and they were very hands-off. We didn't know where they were going to be living and whatever, and they came to us in a taxi and so on. So there was nothing to track and so on. They gave us some things initially to see what we would do with them and so on. But we built up trust and rapport with the family, and they could genuinely see how passionate I was about his work and its relation to other work in the field that correlated with his findings. And they then gave us some more material, and it was a case of they finally relented and said, oh, you can come. And I said, well, we have to give him some things where he can see that. And his daughter and his wife, his daughter came first, then his wife. They said, and of course they were worried about COVID, as all the paranoia about that nonsense. And so they came like after a while, and they said we had no idea really what our father was doing, or my husband was doing, or how important it was. Right? We just knew he was thought it was very important. Right? They didn't really appreciate it,
yeah.
But they could see how much we thought it was important, Sho and myself. And so we were invited round, and I just thought this is the opportunity of all opportunities. So I'd hardly slept for days because we only had a certain amount of time. The videos were a certain length of time. We didn't know if we were ever going to gain access to them again. So we had to go and buy equipment to capture them in any which way was possible. It's not the optimum way, and we're going to do it properly again now we've got the videos. But I had several pieces of key observations that were exactly the same observations, but from different authors that we had observed their witness materials. And so I produced these 3 collage prints, and we went to the local 7-Eleven and got them printed, and we waited for the call for us to be able to go around there, and we went around there and we presented them. And I've never seen a man happier in my entire life. The guy, he had this catheter, he was very frail, but suddenly it's like, you know when it's like someone is basically not functioning at all, and then suddenly they have all the energy in the world. It's like this fire and spark was back in him, and he was speaking quickly, excitedly, and so on. And his wife and his daughter were both in tears. It was one of the most special moments of my life, and it was an honor to meet him, even just briefly. And then he basically said, we can do stuff. And then within the month after, basically he died a month later.
Yeah.
And if I had chosen the second or third time that we could have gone and seen him, he would already be dead.
Yeah.
And this is the thing about life. You just have to move. You have to move fast because you don't know what will happen. You have to be relentless, and ultimately we found out there was a lot of materials. He worked hard he actually worked very hard apparently up until the point we met him to gather all the materials together. He was going to throw the whole lot away. He was going to throw the whole lot away. No one was interested, so on. His family didn't really know what he was doing, and the whole lot would have been lost. It would have been...
That would have been truly terrible, because
There's nothing like it in the field.
It's
Nothing
an
even
enormous
approaching
archive,
it.
yeah. It's a prolific legacy that he's left us.
What he has in the book is fantastic, but it's totally next level when you actually gain access to the negatives.
Yeah, and that's what we should probably touch on next, because I mean, the first time I saw an image from Matsumoto's work, you were showing it with these similar structures that you were finding in the thunderstorm generator, and it was just this little black and white image where you could not really see much. You could see it was very similar, but you couldn't see much of what's going on. And so I've spent the last few months going through these archives, and my wife Emma and I have been taking
Thank you very much for all of your efforts.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. It's I've nearly memorized every image in this book now.
And that will, I think, be very valuable to you moving forward.
Yeah, 100%, because there is nothing like it. It's truly a legacy, but we'll show a couple of the examples. You've already been releasing some previews on the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, and there'll be more coming on the Kickstarter, which we will touch on now as well. But it's essentially, we're doing a remastering of the book, and you know, I've only been on this for a couple months, but you've been working on this with others and other colleagues, which you've
for years now. So actually, it was 3 years ago. We took the original book and we I scanned it. In fact, like, it took 4 or 5 hours because his printer was starting to die when he was printing the last pages of the book that then went into the book, and like every return stroke, it would put 2 or 3 lines through the text. So I had to go through and in scanning it at high resolution and then remove those bits so that then the OCR would work. But like, because I wanted the one-to-one book to be authentic, so everything to be in the right place but to actually be readable. And so I painted these bits out, and then I could use OCR. Of course I could have typed it in or spoke it in. It would probably be quicker, but I wouldn't have had the authentic book, which would be readable.
Which you know can, of course, already obtain that first version of it, both in PDF for free, or it's on at cost price on Amazon and other retailers.
Steps to the Discovery of Electro-Nuclear Collapse.
That's right. We'll put the link there. But more importantly, the remastering of the book.
It's on a Kickstarter. It's going to be launching probably in this coming week in October. I hope to launch it on the night of the start of the 12th, or the last hours of the 12th of this. Sorry, is it the 12th or the 24th? I think 20. What date?
24th.
24th. Yes. So we're going to launch on the 24th. Run for 48 days and finish on the 12th. I think it works out like that. 12th of the 12th, which is the date where we had our first experimental replication 10 years ago of Francesco Celani. And the Kickstarter is going to be called Explaining the Transformational Magic of Ball Lightning.
Fantastic. And we'll probably have the link in the description by the point when we release this interview already, so you'll be able to click on that straight away, hopefully. And just in case.
As long as they approve it.
As long as they approve it, and it's up by then. But
I'm worrying because the main title doesn't include the word nuclear. It's the subtitle where I say remastering the seminal work of Dr. Takaaki Matsumoto, Steps to the Discovery of Electro-Nuclear Collapse. So hopefully that'll get past the auditors there.
So all being well with that, you'll be able to jump on and support the Kickstarter straight away.
There's lots of fantastic things that you can grab as part of that. There will be a unique version of the book. So we're gonna print it like a proper journal. It's going to be cloth bound, but the Kickstarter version is going to be black. The ones that will be available after Kickstarter will be in a red, with gold inlays, and then you're going to have the color sleeve over the outside. So they will be collector's items. Only the number that will be doing the Kickstarter will be produced, and that'll be that.
Yeah, and there's going to be some premium items available as well, including potentially this original
there's
copy of the book.
One of these books, probably this one, will be available. I have 2, but the other one's already spoken for by a party that's already bought it. And so there'll be that, and there'll also be, he has these prints of his work under microscope, or SEM, and
there will be a number of those available, a limited number of those. Typically, they have the date on the back, so you can see that it was made in the 1990s and stuff. And then we're looking to also, for 5 people, they will be able to get one of these composite images. He had this amazing approach to take photographs under the microscope or under the SEM and then stitch them together into bigger images. And they are almost, in many cases, completely unreadable in the book, but they're going to be in the new book, not only not black and white, but in color, but incredible detail in them.
Yeah, you can see so much more. Like in some of the images in the original book, they were pretty much just black with a little white mark there. And now you can see, these amazing fractal structures going on. In the sample.
And also you can see colors information which tells you from experience when you're working with, for instance, copper carbonate is green and copper oxides are red or black, depending on how the light's playing on them. But also, and you'll see this in the cover image, hopefully for the Kickstarter, there is an image where you see that one of these structures has come down and it's left these substructures where it's blue and green and blue and green and blue and green, which we've seen in other work, like the work of Henk Uren, where the fractal toroidal structures that are in, as my understanding, is the core of the ball lightning. It is the toroid that most people refer to as the plasmoid, when that was the understanding. That has substructures, and the substructures have their own spin on them, and when it's spinning one way, it makes a red polarization. When it's spinning the other way, it makes a green polarization. And so you can see this, and it might be partly the way it's depositing different elements down, because it synthesizes oxygen, it synthesizes carbon, or it's aggregating it from the environment. Let's say there's already oxygen in the water, if it's a electrolysis or one-point cold fusion, as he calls them, experiments. But it's the way that it's very discreetly laid down, and it's this spatial arrangement of the elements and the damage that is caused by the impact of these structures on materials, which tells you everything about how they're formed, their life cycle, what they can do, and he really was the maverick in this science.
Yeah, no, it's a true legacy, and like I say, I can't encourage you enough to jump on that Kickstarter, support the project, not just to see this book come about, but you can also be a part of history and get a part of Matsumoto's legacy as well.
And you know what? It was fascinating. In that 1 month between when we saw him and he sadly passed away, he spoke to Sho and he said, you know, when Bob gets these materials, he's going to see some very interesting things. And actually, before I went to, like, we were starting the scanning process, and I had to go to give a presentation in Strasbourg to the cold fusion community. And I said, I must find this thing that he thinks that I'm going to find very interesting. And I'm going through and I'm going through and I'm thinking, oh, and that in the middle of these, what he calls cold fusion stars, where you have these point structures that blow up into these ejected things that are coming out of a point, almost exactly the same as we saw out of cavitation fuel from Suhas Ralkar, where after it was put in the container, these things blew up, and they actually were so powerful that they would produce tram lines cut in the polycarbonate container, and it looked the same but in 3 dimensions as the images of Matsumoto. In those same negatives, he had these what he called black hole structures, and in between them there were these other structures which were toroidal. Now in his book he describes them, and I, you know, when I was producing the initial replication, I was reading through everything and we were remastering it, but at that time I didn't understand the structure in the way that I did since. And he describes these ring structures which have sub-rings in them. And normally he said 42 in the ones that he was observing, but you can't see it. You can't see it in the images that are in the book, but you can in the negatives. And he said there were about 8 of these structures, and he chose, I think, 3, which were about 42. So the majority of them were 42. But there were 2 others that I found in these negative sets. And one of them, it's got a different number in there, and very clearly the subtors. And he also looks at it at 2 depths. So you can see that as you go through the focal plane, you get to see other parts of the substructure. But he had another one where it would appear it has the 48 number, which, as far as I can work out, is the maximum number you can have, because the cores then they have this double layer which produces the hollow iron-rich crenellated spheres, and when you get more than 48, the outside skin interacts with the inside hollow area, and it could just it falls apart at that scale, as far as I can work out.
Yeah.
And he had this 48 structure, so it's a torus structure with looks like a very near, damn it, if it's not 48 substructures. And then in some of those substructures, it has substructures. It has the wheel within a wheel within a wheel. And he saw this in the early 1990s. And to me, being able to show that to the LENR community, to say, look, you know, I've been talking about this thing for half a decade now, or building this argument, and we've actually been able to see these in witness materials. They look exactly like the structures by Winston Bostic and Nardi in their 1980 paper. And then we found the physical 3D structures. Now we have an electrodynamic structure that explains how they form, why they can do transmutation, why they can do zero-point energy harvesting, and that they are ball lightning / micro ball lightning. And here we have a guy that, prior to him calling it ball lightning, had actually observed this on nuclear emulsions. And I started my presentation basically with a question, the main part of my presentation. I said, does anyone here have any experience in nuclear emulsions, radiographic emulsions? Dead silence. Does anyone have anyone in their teams that are experienced in nuclear emulsions? Dead silence. And so I then showed the technology, the electrodynamics, what it can do, what it's been seen to do, and then I revealed that Matsumoto had already seen this. He just hadn't ever published it, not even in that book. So it's an amazing journey. What an incredible guy. Thank you very much to the Matsumoto family for allowing us access to the archive, entrusting it with us. Thanks again to Jordan and his wife for helping with the scanning and indexing of those items. And thank you to all of the people out there that have supported this, because it's been going now for, well, since 2018. And so you're going to have in your hand a document that represents what a lot of the things that Matsumoto actually saw to bring him to his conclusions. And you can understand his logic about how he derived what was going on in a way that you would not with the current book.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a piece of history and a piece of the future as well. As we see these technologies develop and come about more and more, this is going to be an incredibly important work. And I'm also very grateful to have the chance to have this insider perspective on it and get to know his work. Yeah, and I have to give credit to Malcolm Bendel. When we were short on funds, we suddenly found we had 142 kilograms to bring back. We didn't have the money for buying bags and for paying for the extra baggage, and he came up with the money. And so thank you to Malcolm Bendel for doing that. That enabled these materials to be brought here. And the weird thing is that essentially what's going on in his thunderstorm generator, whether it's doing anything in the round, I can tell you for certain that there must be plasmoids in there, in the actual spheres, and the counter-rotating vortices inside, between the outside and the inside and the inside of the outside, at the very least, because we are seeing what we see in other systems, metal being taken out of or synthesized from the environment, local or and then collected into these iron-rich crenellated spheres, which I predicted would be in there like we'd found in other systems, and then projected and made more pure iron and oxygen crenellated spheres. And so if those systems are there, we know from Matsumoto's work, we know from Leclerc's work, we know from Roisin Amaza's work, we know from the work of Leonid Dorodzkiev, our work, many different examples of that, and so forth, that this has the ability to transmute matter. And in the fullness of time, we'll know how regularly that happens in the thunderstorm generator, and whether it's once in a blue moon. But I suspect, since we see it in
in cavitation systems continuously happening. And in the work of Binwen Huang, who I've been working with the last couple of years, his system is producing structures which are perfectly apple-shaped, and inside them there are the two tores that join in the middle. They break out, and inside those breaks out substructures, which are the wheels that are in the wheel, which is in the wheel.
Yeah.
And that is a cavitation structure. It's charge separation, hydrodynamic shear. The thunderstorm generator has charge separation, hydrodynamic shear. So I don't see any reason why it can't be in there too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I mean by this being part of the future, because I think this is certainly the future of technology. Devices being built on these principles. And yeah, we're seeing more and more of that come out right now. It's, yeah, very exciting. So we're just about out of time, but I just wanted to ask you, where can we, well, I know, but let's tell everyone else, where can we find more of your work? You've got a blog, you've got the channel.
So the YouTube channel for the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, which I've been volunteering for over a decade now, is at MFMP, or you can type in Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project. You can also see on Twitter, MFMP or Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project. You can see the old historical site at quantumheat.org, so you can see our early days there as an archive. And you can even interact and donate through the donation page there. A lot of the videos have a donation option, or rather details in there. You can support me personally through my blog, which is at remoteview.icu. It's a Substack blog. And you can subscribe there, and if you subscribe, it's really the best way, because I work through there because it's not controlled by a big corporation, and I have access to the data, and it's not censored in the way that many of the other places are. And so you can engage there, you can ask questions, you can upload pictures and so on. You can share your understanding or questions or challenges to my thinking or those of others. And that is the main place where you can engage with me and help support my work. And then the Kickstarter, as I said again, it will be happening soon. And there are unique things you can get on the Kickstarter that will never be available again. It's a one-off opportunity to be part of history. You will have the option on the higher tier levels to be, or even in the mid-tier levels, to have your name and or your company name in the book, and as a contributor / major contributor. And you'll also be able to get actual genuine artifacts that were produced by the hand of Dr. Matsumoto, that absolute maverick genius that really I think we're all going to owe a debt of gratitude as we move into the future.
Yeah, he's going to become very well known within time. I've got absolutely no doubt.
So the name of the Kickstarter will be Explanation of the Magic of Ball Lightning, something like that. Something like that.
You'll be able to click the link in the description. We'll have that up there. And
I want to say again a thank you to Jordan and his wife for everything they've done here, and I'm sure we'll be seeing each other in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yes.
Wait to see more. We'll be documenting all of this.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you, Bob. Really appreciate the time for the interview
and
the whole stay here and what we've got out of it.
Yeah.
Until next time.